Okay, so today's video lesson looks a little different for you online learners, and it's because this is also actually being used for my afternoon classes. So the video that is embedded into the PowerPoint that goes over the Glorious Revolution, I'm actually going to go ahead and play it, which I know is kind of awkward because I'm going to have my face over here in the corner. I'm probably actually just going to remove myself from the box so that I'm not just awkwardly sitting here while the video is going. But what I want you guys to do, of course, is watch the video over the Glorious Revolution, and so that it's a nice kind of review from the information from yesterday that we talked about. And then I'm just going to finish up and wrap up lesson 2 before you take your formative assessments. Okay. So with that being said, here is the video. Push play.
Now, what I've got to do to put Peterloo into context, I've got to explain who was really in control of England in the 150 years or so between the civil wars of the 17th century and Peterloo in the early 19th century. And to find out who really had the power back then, I'm driving through the exquisite countryside of Derbyshire, and I'm heading for a stately pile that's without doubt one of the great treasures of England. It's still in private hands. It's the family home of the Dukes of Devonshire. And I've come here to Chatsworth to tell the story of a distant ancestor of the present Duke, a man called William Cavendish. And his story, I think, is very revealing. The story begins in 1660, when, after years of civil war, Charles II was restored to the English throne. And William Cavendish was one of the young noblemen who carried the train at his coronation. Now, these were glorious years in English history. Charles, of course, was the merry monarch, and Cavendish, too, had a reputation as a gambler and a womanizer. And yet, beneath all this frivolity, a serious question bubbled. Who now really held the power in the land? The king, the parliament, the people? The death of Charles's father, Charles I, hung as an ominous reminder now of the limits on the power of kings. Well, this question of who really controlled England came to a head in 1685 with the death of Charles II, because the man who inherited the throne was his brother James, and no merry monarch he. James saw himself as an absolute ruler. He seemed to ignore the lessons of the Civil War. He wanted the army back under his direct control. He ruled without parliament. And what was worse in the eyes of Protestant England, he was a Catholic, and he dreamt of reimposing Catholicism on his kingdom. Now you look at the situation from the point of view of a man like William Cavendish. By this point in the story, 1685, he'd inherited from his father. He was Master of Chatsworth. He was the 4th Earl of Devonshire. He had a seat now, not in the Commons, but in the House of Lords. And he believed, as a member of the landed aristocracy, he had a natural part to play in the running of the kingdom. But this new king was cutting the aristocracy out of the loop. It was clear something had to be done. And it's what happened next that reveals who really held the strings in early modern England. The scene now shifts to London, where Cavendish met in secret with 6 friends, all of them, like him, members of England's landed elite. And between them, they plotted the overthrow of King James II. They wrote in code a letter, which they smuggled abroad to a Protestant prince, William of Orange. The letter said, "Come to England, overthrow James, take the crown, rule in his place. We'll back you." William of Orange did as the letter suggested. He sailed to England with an army. Meanwhile, Cavendish rode to Derby with a small retinue to hold the north until the transfer of power was secure. James II fled to the continent, and the glorious revolution of 1688 was complete. Now, I want to ask just one question about these events. I want to ask, what part did the people play in this so-called revolution? Usually, in a revolution, the people rise up and overthrow the established order. This wasn't a revolution. At best, this was a kind of palace coup. One king moved aside, another brought into play. And who's controlling the action? A small circle of wealthy landowners. We call it the Glorious Revolution. But all it did was to transfer power out of the hands of kings into the hands of the rich. Kings now ruled under the thumb of Parliament, a debating chamber of lords and gentlemen from which ordinary people were excluded. And true democracy remained as distant a dream as ever. For his part in the Glorious Revolution, William Cavendish was made a duke, the first Duke of Devonshire, and his power and his influence grew. In this part of England, young gentlemen seeking to advance their careers would come here to Chatsworth. They'd curry favour with the Duke. In elections, only those with property could vote, and the Duke's candidates stood unopposed. He had 5 seats in the House of Commons he could just hand out as gifts. His heirs rose to high office. They became ministers, even prime ministers. And for 150 years, the power of property, the power of the land, continued unquestioned.
Okay, so clearly, the Glorious Revolution and the shift of power from the monarchs to Parliament, it's not like all of a sudden England is some like democratic spot. I mean, as he said, all this does is transfer power from, the royal family into the hands of like the uber wealthy, and so, okay, there are more people that are spreading the power amongst them, but it's still a wealth game. Okay. And it's going to remain that way for a long time, really, in England. So I don't want you to think, after our conversation about the Glorious Revolution, when we ended with William and Mary signing the English Bill of Rights, that like now all of a sudden England looks as the way it looks like today, because that's not true. We still have lots of changes that have to come in English history that gets them, closer to where they are today as a constitutional monarchy. So, just kind of bear that in mind. You have to, this is still 1688, people. So understand kind of like the norms of politics and of that time. This was pretty progressive even then, even though it's, the rich still have power. Like the fact that they didn't have an absolute monarch was like a whoa kind of moment in this, in the late 17th century. But, again, I told you yesterday it's called the Glorious Revolution because, of course, there's no bloodshed, and this shifts power to the Parliament. So, of course, we just watched that. So one of the things that I want to end lesson 2 talking about are 2 men, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. You've probably heard of John Locke from 8th grade U.S. history because he is often cited, of course, as being a huge, influential Enlightenment philosophe that is going to directly influence the writings of our founding fathers. But, with that being said, again, you kind of have to take those statements with a grain of salt. And because John Locke and Thomas Hobbes in a lot of ways are always, hailed as being like founders of democratic thinking and things like that. And that's really kind of misleading. That's not really all that true. they were still men of their time and their norms and their generation. And what we consider today like democratic thought, if you were to go back in time and explain it to them, they'd be like, oh, that's not what I mean at all. But again, as I say all the time, you can't look at the past through the lens of the present. But let's talk about Thomas Hobbes. He's going to publish a book called Leviathan in 1651, and it's essentially arguing that humans are never guided by reason. They're always essentially guided by like self-preservation, period, end of story. Like that is the driving force behind human nature. That is the driving force behind every single thing that happens in history. It is full on self-preservation. Okay. And the only reason why we have any type of government is because to like create some type of order and so that we don't completely destroy each other, we elect leaders or we create leaders, and so that there is some type of social order, and I've said this from the beginning really of this class. In a lot of ways, he's arguing the same thing I've explained about the social pyramids. Okay, people naturally place themselves into social classes, or they naturally create a chain of command because it gives you a sense of stability. It gives you a sense of like, okay, this is my little spot. All right, or this is who I need to go to if I have a question or whatever. And so that's essentially what Thomas Hobbes is saying in Leviathan. Okay, John Locke is going to publish 2 treatises of government in 1690. He is going to argue against the absolute rule of one person. Hang on just a second. What? Okay. That's fine. Sorry. Okay, so this is why I always do these during my conference period. But I don't have time to do that tomorrow, so I'm doing it now. All right. He does argue against the absolute rule of one person. But instead of saying, we have government because we are trying to create self-preservation instead of chaos, have order, he is saying that we do it because we want to preserve our natural rights. Like we create government because we want our natural rights, which are, of course, life and what he says, liberty and property, to be preserved. And in order to do that, and in order to have that, you have to have some type of like control. And so that is the reason why we create, states and governments and such. The reason why I have over here on the top right of the screen is, in bold words, misconception, is because, to Locke, when he said like all people have these natural rights, he's not really talking about every person on the planet. Okay? He is meaning like those that have property, that pay property taxes, and are truly like land holding people. And these are going to be like, for the most part, your aristocrats. He was not some huge advocate of democracy. Our founding fathers kind of took what he said and ran with it. And you have to also consider, our founding fathers didn't look at all people equally. I mean, because that was like unheard of at the time. I mean, and so, even to our founding fathers, the people that originally, they were talking about in terms of the Constitution and, everything, that they're meaning the landowners, even in the United States, and as you see, if you study U.S. history at all, and you'll study it next year, there's big issues that come about because we've got to change the meaning of certain words as society moves forward and progresses. But that's the other beautiful thing about our founding fathers and our Constitution, is the fact that they made sure that it could be amended because they knew like society's going to change, people are going to change, and we got to be able to change this document as that happens. But anyways, so Hobbes and Locke are two, of course, English political theorists that highly influence England and then, of course, the United States in the years to come once revolution hits over there, or over here, I should say. And, this kind of feeds into our next unit, which, of course, is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But that is it for today. I told you guys it was going to be pretty short and sweet, the video and then talking about these two. And now I want you to take your formative assessment. Okay, it's already posted in Google Classroom, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Shout out to you, John. You're going to be okay. See you Friday. TGIF. Bye.